The War Council of the Varric Dominion did not ask questions. They issued directives and the universe obeyed. So when Supreme Admiral Keth Voran stood before the Conclave of 12 and announced that the blue-green world designated Sector 7 Kale would be pacified within one standard cycle, no one objected. No one pulled up population estimates or technological assessments. No one asked about the species that lived there. The Dominion had absorbed 61 worlds in 4 centuries. The process was mechanical by now: survey, assess, suppress, absorb. The creature living on a particular world rarely mattered. What mattered was the mineral content of its crust and the agricultural value of its surface. Princess Sariva Voran was not supposed to be in that chamber. She was 23 years old by her planet's reckoning, the youngest daughter of Admiral Keth, which made her precisely important enough to attend formal functions and precisely unimportant enough to have no real power. She stood near the back wall in the dark gray uniform of a junior intelligence attaché copyright, a position her father had arranged to give her something to do, and she watched the holographic display rotate slowly above the council table. The planet was mostly water. Pale blue. Thin white cloud formations moving in slow spiral patterns. 2 large land masses in the northern hemisphere, several smaller ones distributed near the equatorial belt. Preliminary survey indicates a technologically adolescent civilization, the briefing officer announced. They have achieved basic orbital flight and possess crude nuclear capability. No unified planetary government. No functioning interstellar communication. Estimated time to self-resolution, approximately 140 of their years at current trajectory. Self-resolution. The Dominion's polite term for a species destroying itself before the fleet arrived. Sariva raised her hand. The room did not notice. She raised it higher. Her father noticed. He looked at her with the particular exhaustion of a parent who loves a child but wished she would stop. "My daughter," he said, because dismissing her directly would be beneath his rank. Every face in the room turned toward her. 12 senior officers, 2 planetary governors, 3 intelligence chiefs. She was 23 and she had interrupted a war council. "I would like to conduct the cultural assessment," she said, "for the pre-invasion report." There was a silence. Then someone coughed. "The cultural assessment is a formality," the briefing officer said carefully. "It is generally assigned to third-tier analysts. It carries no strategic weight." "I understand," Sariva said. "I am requesting it anyway." Her father studied her for a long moment. Then, because he was a practical man who understood that giving his daughter a meaningless task was cheaper than arguing with her in front of his officers, he nodded once. 30 cycles, he said. "You have 30 cycles to file your report. The fleet departs on schedule regardless." 30 cycles. Approximately 1 month by the reckoning of the world she was about to study. She thanked him, left the chamber, and went directly to the intelligence archives. The species called itself many things in many languages. The dominant linguistic families used variations of a common root word. In their most widely spoken tongue they called themselves humans. She sat down at the archive terminal, opened the survey files and began to read. She did not sleep for the first 3 days. The data was voluminous. Millennia of recorded history, imperfectly preserved but vast. War and art and architecture. Philosophy and religion and legal theory. Agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, digital revolution, each one cascading into the next faster than the previous. The sheer density of it was staggering. The Dominion survey drones had been passively collecting human transmissions for nearly 60 of their years. Radio, then television, then the fragmented global network they called the Internet. Billions of individual human voices, arguing and laughing and grieving and creating, all of it archived in servers the size of a small city. Sariva had assessed 17 pre-contact civilizations during her time as an attaché copyright. Most of them produced cultural records that could be meaningfully summarized in a few thousand pages. Dominant ideology, primary conflicts, leadership structure, societal hierarchy. Clean and legible. The humans were not clean or legible. They contradicted themselves at every scale. A nation would enshrine individual freedom in its founding documents and then spend centuries selectively denying that freedom to portions of its own population. A religion that preached compassion as its central virtue would be invoked to justify massacres. A species smart enough to map its own genome would simultaneously insist that the planet warming beneath its feet was not happening, or that it was happening but could not be stopped, or that it was happening and could be stopped but stopping it was economically inconvenient. They were, she wrote in her preliminary notes, aggressively incoherent. But she kept reading. On the 4th day she reached the section on human warfare. She had expected this. Every civilization fought. Fighting was the mechanism through which resources were redistributed and hierarchies were enforced. She had read the warfare records of dozens of species. They were generally straightforward. Group A wanted what Group B had. They fought. 1-1. History continued. The humans fought like that too sometimes. But sometimes they fought for things that defied dominion categories entirely. They fought over abstract concepts. Over the correct interpretation of texts written by people who had been dead for 1,000 years. Over borders that had been drawn by bureaucrats in distant capitals who had never visited the land they were dividing. They fought over honor. Over insults. Over debt. Over the memory of old fights. And then a euro, and this was the part that made Sariva sit back in her chair and stare at the ceiling for a long time. A euro. Sometimes they stopped. Not because one side was destroyed. Not because resources had been exhausted. Sometimes they simply stopped, and the people who had been killing each other sat down across a table and worked out an arrangement, and then they traded with each other, and sometimes, generations later, they built monuments together to commemorate the people who had died in the fighting, and they stood at those monuments, the descendants of both sides, and they wept. She had never read anything like that in 61 worlds of Dominion history. She filed a preliminary request for expanded archive access and requested 2 additional cycles of research time. The administrator approved it without reading the request, because cultural assessments were, as everyone agreed, a formality. Sariva turned back to her terminal. She had barely started. By the end of the first week, Sariva had stopped sleeping on a regular schedule. She ate at her terminal, consuming whatever the food unit produced without tasting it, because she had discovered something in the human archives that she could not explain and could not stop thinking about. The humans remembered things they had no practical reason to remember. This was not the same as record-keeping. The Dominion kept records. Every civilized species kept records. Resource inventories, legal precedents, tactical histories. Memory in the service of function. The humans did that too, but they also did something else entirely. They preserved memory for its own sake, at enormous effort and cost, in every medium available to them. Stone and clay and parchment and ink and celluloid and magnetic tape and digital encoding. They preserved the names of ordinary people who had lived and died in obscurity. They preserved songs that had no political significance. They preserved the exact shape of buildings that had been destroyed, rebuilding them when possible, photographing and measuring them obsessively when not. They built structures whose sole purpose was to make people remember specific things. Sariva spent an entire day on human memorial architecture alone. The range was overwhelming. Entire cemeteries, maintained for centuries, where families came to speak to people who had been dead for generations. Walls of names, thousands of names, carved into black stone so that anyone who wanted to could run their finger across the letters of someone who had died before they were born. Underground museums preserving the physical remnants of historical atrocities, the shoes of murdered children, the eyeglasses of the elderly, the documents that had classified human beings as property. She understood, intellectually, why a species might preserve evidence of its worst episodes. Deterrence. Warning. Look what we became so we do not become it again. But that was not quite what she was seeing. She was seeing something closer to grief. A species that refused to let its dead be merely dead. That kept bringing them forward into the present, not as data but as presences. The photographs on the walls of houses, decades after the subject had died. The stories told to children about grandparents who had never met them. The holidays built around the act of remembering those who were gone. The Dominion had absorbed 61 worlds. In all of that history she could not find a comparable cultural practice at this scale. The Dominion honored its war dead with monuments, yes, but the monuments were symbols of the Dominion's power, not attempts to preserve the individual humanity of specific people. A name on a Dominion monument was a data point. A name on a human memorial was something else. She requested the psychological analysis files and spent 3 days reading studies that human scientists had conducted on their own species. The field they called psychology was surprisingly sophisticated for a pre-contact civilization. They had identified, classified, and extensively debated the mechanisms of their own minds, including an extensive literature on what they called grief, and a separate literature on what they called post-traumatic response, and a long and contested debate about whether these were pathologies to be treated or natural processes to be supported. A species that studied its own suffering with such deliberate seriousness was unusual. Most civilizations either ritualized suffering into manageable forms or suppressed it through cultural prohibitions. The humans did both of those things in certain contexts, but they also did something rarer. They sat with it. They wrote about it. They made art about it, enormous quantities of art in every form available to them, much of it about loss and death and the strange persistence of love past the point of death. She found a genre of human music that seemed to exist solely for the purpose of transforming sorrow into something that could be shared. Humans sat in large groups and listened to it together. They cried. Then they went home. She played several pieces through her audio system at low volume and sat in the dark of her quarters for a long time afterward, not crying because she was Varric and the Varric did not cry, but something in her chest felt heavier than it had before. On the 8th day she found the section of the archive labeled, Resistance and Survival. It had been compiled by one of the survey drones as a subcategory of tactical assessment. The drone's algorithm had flagged various historical episodes in which human populations had refused to surrender under conditions that should, statistically, have made surrender the logical choice. The drone had labeled these as anomalous data and set them aside for potential review. Sariva opened the file. The episodes spanned thousands of years in every major geographic region of the planet. A small city holding against a siege that lasted years, its population starving, refusing to open its gates while civilizations rose and fell around it. A people stripped of their land and language and religious practice, dispersed across a continent, maintaining their cultural identity in secret for generations until circumstances changed. A resistance movement operating in occupied territory, leaving messages on walls at night, continuing to produce an underground newspaper that everyone involved knew would result in their imprisonment or death if discovered. The drone had flagged these as anomalous because they were, by any resource calculus, irrational. The cost of resistance exceeded the probable benefit. The rational choice in each case was accommodation or surrender. The humans kept choosing the irrational option. She read one account in particular 3 times. A small group of humans in a city that had been almost completely destroyed continued to fight a much larger occupying force for weeks after any military purpose had been served by the fighting. They were not relieving pressure on another front. They were not buying time for reinforcements. They were simply refusing to let the city be taken without a cost so steep that the takers would remember it. A note in the tactical file from the survey drone read, Purpose of continued resistance unclear. No strategic benefit identified. Possible communication failure regarding terms of surrender. Sariva stared at that note for a long time. Now she thought. You didn't understand what you were looking at. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting so that the cost of defeating them would be recorded in the memory of the people who had done it. They were fighting to make themselves impossible to forget. She opened a new document and started writing. Not her official report. Something else. Notes to herself, working through what she was seeing. She was beginning to understand that she had been sent to assess a civilization. She was beginning to suspect she had not been given nearly enough time. In the second week, Sariva moved past history and into mathematics. The Dominion's invasion models were elegant. They had been refined across 61 campaigns and they were, by every internal measure, accurate. A civilization at the human's technology level presented a Class 4 resistance profile. Primitive orbital capability, ground-based nuclear deterrence, no capacity for interstellar response. Class 4 pacification required a 3-phase approach. Neutralize orbital assets, establish air superiority over population centers, present terms of surrender with a demonstration strike sufficient to make the cost of continued resistance obvious. From the point of demonstration strike to full planetary submission. Estimated 16 to 22 days. Sariva had run this model for every Class 4 world the Dominion had absorbed. It worked. It was reliable. The numbers were sound. She ran it for Earth and the numbers came back the same. Then she put the model aside and spent a day reading about the specific demonstration strike protocol and what it would actually mean in physical terms. The model expressed everything in abstraction. Yield ratios, resistance coefficient reduction, submission probability curves. She wanted the unabstracted version. She found it in a subcategory of human historical records that the survey drone had labeled nuclear exchange simulations. The humans, with characteristic thoroughness, had spent several decades calculating exactly what would happen to their civilization if nuclear weapons were used at scale. The studies were detailed enough to make her stop several times and sit with her eyes closed. Population mortality curves. Infrastructure collapse cascades. Agricultural system failure timelines. The phrase nuclear winter appeared repeatedly, referring to a secondary atmospheric effect that the humans had identified as potentially civilization ending even for a party that won such an exchange. The humans knew exactly what they were sitting on. They had studied it obsessively. They had written novels and made films about it. They had conducted thousands of policy debates about it, and they had not disarmed. This was the fact that the invasion model did not adequately represent. The Class 4 model assumed that a sufficiently devastating demonstration would break resistance will. It assumed that the defending species, confronted with evidence of the attacker's capability, would perform a rational cost-benefit analysis and conclude that survival was preferable to continued resistance. But the humans had already performed that analysis. They had performed it repeatedly in great detail for generations. They knew that a full nuclear exchange might kill most of them. And they had not, in response to this knowledge, made themselves incapable of it. They had made it the cornerstone of their entire strategic doctrine. The concept was called mutually assured destruction. Sariva read the primary literature on it for 2 days. The logic was alien to Dominion strategic thinking, but it was not illogical. If you could guarantee that any attack on you would result in the destruction of the attacker, then attacks became irrational regardless of the attacker's relative strength. The humans had built their entire defensive posture around this guarantee. They could not survive a nuclear exchange. They knew this, but neither could whoever initiated one. The question the invasion model did not ask was, would humans initiate it anyway? She spent the rest of the day reading human decision-making under existential threat. The historical record was not reassuring. Humans under existential threat did not consistently make rational calculations. They made emotional ones. They made decisions based on identity and honor and the refusal to be defeated by something they considered unjust, even when the mathematics of survival pointed clearly in another direction. She found accounts of military commanders who had explicitly stated, in the final hours before defeat, that they would rather destroy everything than surrender it. She found religious frameworks that celebrated martyrdom, the voluntary acceptance of death in resistance to what was considered an unacceptable power. She found popular stories, consumed enthusiastically across generations, in which a small group of humans facing impossible odds chose to fight rather than flee, and these stories were not presented as tragedies of poor decision-making but as the highest possible expression of human character. A species that idealized the irrational willingness to fight to the end was a species that might, when faced with alien invasion, actually fight to the end. She ran a modified version of the invasion model with adjusted resistance parameters. The results were considerably less clean than the original. In the original model, the demonstration strike broke 78% of organized resistance within 72 hours. In her modified model, accounting for the historical human tendency to continue fighting past the point of rational analysis, the estimate dropped to 31%. More troublingly, the model flagged a 22% probability that a demonstration strike would not suppress nuclear response capability before launch windows opened. She sat with that number for a long time. 22% probability of nuclear exchange with a planet that had enough warheads to create an atmospheric event. The fleet that was coming was not equipped for atmospheric contamination at that scale. The boarding troops were not vaccinated against the biological agents that a nuclear winter would release into food chains. The supply chain for a 22-day pacification assumed stable planetary infrastructure. A destabilized human biosphere could take decades to restabilize, if it restabilized at all. The mineral content of Earth's crust was valuable, but it was not worth absorbing a biosphere collapse. She began writing a second document, this one structured like an actual report, and then stopped. Because she realized she had been thinking about this entirely in terms of Dominion strategic interest, and she had just spent 2 weeks reading about a species that did not, in general, respond well to being thought about in terms of someone else's strategic interest. She closed the strategic document. She opened a new file and labeled it simply, "What are they?" And she began trying to answer that question properly for the first time. The third week began with art. Not because art was strategically relevant. It was not. The invasion model had no field for cultural output. The tactical assessors had catalogued human artistic production as a tertiary category. Evidence of cognitive complexity, potential marker of social cohesion, no direct military significance. The survey drone had collected a representative sample and filed it under non-essential cultural data. Sariva opened the non-essential cultural data folder and found it was larger than every other folder in the archive combined. She had known, abstractly, that humans produced enormous quantities of art. But the scale of it was something she had not prepared for. Every generation, in every region, in every century for which records existed, humans had made things that had no survival function. They carved figures into bone and stone before they had cities. They painted the walls of their dwelling spaces before they had writing. They made music before they had agriculture. The impulse preceded civilization, preceded literacy, preceded every practical advance the species had made. And they had never stopped. Each generation produced more in more forms with more technical sophistication and more deliberate strangeness. By the period of the survey, they were producing so much that no individual human could meaningfully encounter more than a fraction of it in an entire lifetime. She spent a day trying to understand what they were doing with all of it. The explanations in the human literature were varied and contradictory, which she had come to recognize as a reliable signal that the humans themselves found the question genuinely difficult. Some argued that art was primarily a communication technology, a way of transmitting subjective experience between minds that would otherwise be isolated from each other. Others argued it was a survival mechanism, a way of processing experiences too large or too painful to integrate through normal cognition. Others argued it was a form of play, an evolved pleasure response associated with pattern recognition that had been co-opted for social purposes. Several argued that it was something that could not be reduced to function at all, that it was an end in itself, which the more practically minded critics found unsatisfying and the more philosophically minded critics considered the only honest answer. Sareva suspected all of these were partially correct and that the humans would continue arguing about it indefinitely, because that was what they did with questions they could not resolve. She started working through the sample collection more deliberately, trying to develop an intuition for what she was seeing. The visual arts section alone took 3 days. She moved through tens of thousands of images. The ochre handprints on cave walls, which were the oldest, and which stopped her for a long time because the gesture was so unmistakably intentional, the deliberate placement of a self-made mark on the surface of the world. Ancient friezes depicting battle and ceremony and agricultural labor with a formality that paradoxically felt intimate. The explosion of European Renaissance painting, which achieved a technical virtuosity with light and flesh that she found genuinely disorienting, because she had not expected to find that quality of precise observation from a species that was also, simultaneously, fighting wars over which version of a religion was correct. Modern abstraction, which required lengthy explanatory text to interpret and which she mostly did not understand but which she noted the humans seemed to argue about with considerable passion, suggesting it mattered to them in ways she had not yet mapped. And then she reached the section on portraiture. For 2 full days she worked through human portrait painting and photography. The practice of making a likeness of a specific person, in enough detail that someone who knew them would recognize them, and then preserving that likeness so that they could be seen after they were gone. She found a photograph taken approximately 140 years before the present by her reckoning, of a young woman standing in front of a modest building. The photograph was black and white and slightly blurred at the edges. The woman was looking directly at whatever device had captured her image, and her expression was specific in a way that Sareva found difficult to categorize. Not quite smiling. Not quite solemn. Something in between, as if she knew that this moment would outlast her and was deciding, in real time, what she wanted to communicate to whoever would eventually be looking. Sareva stared at this photograph for a very long time. She did not know who this woman was. The photograph's metadata had been corrupted. No name was attached. She was not famous. She had not done anything that the historical record had considered worth preserving in text. She had simply been alive and been photographed, and now she was here, in Sareva's archive, being looked at by someone from 60 light-years away who had not yet been born when the shutter clicked. That was what the humans were doing with all of it. They were refusing to let each other disappear. Every portrait, every biography, every song written in memory of someone, every building preserved past its useful life because of who had once stood inside it all of it was the same gesture, scaled to different sizes. We were here. This specific person was here, with this specific face and this specific expression, and we refused to let the universe proceed as if they were not. She sat for a long time after that realization, and she thought about the 61 worlds the Dominion had absorbed, and the cultures that had been simplified and standardized and integrated into the Dominion's administrative framework, and the names that had not been preserved, and the faces that no one had thought to photograph. She opened her working notes and wrote, "I am not sure we have been doing this correctly." Then she sat with what she had written and she did not delete it. On the 19th day, Sareva did something she was not authorized to do. She sent a message. It was not, technically, a communication to Earth. She was careful about that. What she sent was a narrowband data query to one of the survey drones currently positioned in the outer belt of the human solar system, requesting a real-time compilation of current human communications across their major information networks. This was within her access clearance. She was, after all, conducting a cultural assessment. The data returned within a few hours and she spent the next 2 days reading it. The volume was staggering, but she had developed, over 3 weeks of immersion, a reasonable ability to navigate it. She knew what she was looking for: current human discourse, the texture of what they were actually thinking and arguing about and paying attention to in the present. She found it in pieces. They were arguing right now about their climate. They had been arguing about it for decades. The scientific consensus was clear. The humans had their own scientists telling them, with high precision and increasing urgency, exactly what was happening to their atmosphere and what the probable consequences were. A substantial portion of their political leadership was nonetheless finding reasons not to act, or to act insufficiently, or to dispute the science through funding mechanisms that created the appearance of legitimate disagreement. It was, she thought, the most expensive argument she had ever observed, measured in probable future cost to the species conducting it. And yet, she also found the engineers designing better solar cells and the lawyers arguing climate cases in courts and the young people filling streets with handmade signs and the scientists who had spent their entire careers documenting a disaster they could not stop alone and who showed up for work anyway every morning because someone had to keep the record accurate. She found a long discussion, distributed across thousands of individual posts in a public forum, about a specific type of tree that was native to a small island and had been reduced to a single living specimen. The discussion was practical in places, addressing seed banking and propagation techniques, but it was also something else. It was humans caring about a tree, a single specific tree on a small island, with a seriousness and tenderness that the Dominion's resource calculus had no category for. She found arguments about justice. Long, complicated, frequently heated arguments about the correct way to organize a society such that it was fair to the people living in it. The arguments were not new. They had been running for millennia in various forms. They showed no signs of resolution. But they also showed no signs of stopping, which she was beginning to understand was its own kind of answer. The humans who were most angry about injustice were generally the ones who had been most directly harmed by it, and their anger was not a sign of despair but of the continued belief that things could be different, that the world could be made better than it was, that the argument was worth having. A species that kept arguing for justice generation after generation without ever fully achieving it and without ever fully giving up, was a species that had not decided the world was fixed. She found, in a section of the archive flagged as cultural products, something the humans called speculative fiction. Stories about the future, about other worlds, about contact with other intelligences. She read a selection of them and found them, in aggregate, revelatory. The humans had been imagining contact with alien civilizations for over a century. Some of their imagined aliens were hostile, coming to conquer or consume. Others were benevolent. Many were somewhere in between. But what she found most significant was not the aliens in these stories but the humans. How they responded, what they valued, what they refused to compromise even under impossible pressure. In story after story after story, the humans chose the same things. They chose each other. They fought for the strangers beside them and the family behind them and the ideals that their civilizations had enshrined in founding documents they spent generations failing to live up to and never stopped trying to reach. They were not consistent and they were not always brave and they often made terrible choices, in the stories as in the history, but the direction of the choosing was, more often than not, toward something rather than away from it. Toward survival. Toward dignity. Toward the continuation of the argument. She sat back from her terminal and looked at the star map on the wall of her workspace. Earth was a pinpoint of light among thousands, unremarkable in every physical measure that the Dominion used to evaluate worlds. She thought about the fleet. It was already assembled. It was already fueled. The departure date was in 11 days. She thought about what the fleet would find when it arrived. Billions of humans going about the business of their contradictory, inefficient, magnificently determined lives, arguing and creating and grieving and loving and refusing, always refusing to simply stop. She thought about the 22% figure in her modified invasion model. She thought about the woman in the photograph, with her particular expression. She opened a new document, and this time she wrote the words at the top that she had been avoiding for 3 weeks. Formal strategic assessment. Sector 7 Kale, designated species, human. And she began to write what she actually thought. The formal assessment ran to 412 pages. This was unprecedented. The standard cultural assessment was between 15 and 40 pages. Even the most thorough pre-contact analyses in Dominion history had not exceeded 180. When Sariva transmitted the document to the Fleet Intelligence Office for routing to her father's desk, she received an automated response informing her that the file size exceeded standard parameters and asking her to confirm that it had been sent correctly. She confirmed it. Then she sat in her quarters and waited. The document was structured conventionally, because she had understood from the beginning that an unconventional structure would be dismissed before it was read. She had opened with the standard metrics: technology level, resource value assessment, population density, resistance capability estimate. She had included all of the data that a tactical analyst would expect to find, presented in the format they were trained to read. And then, section by section, she had built a case. Section 1 addressed the nuclear deterrence situation in detail, with her modified invasion model and its probability estimates. She had been conservative with her numbers, erring toward the optimistic end of the range, because she knew that pessimistic projections would be dismissed as overcautious. Even the conservative estimate flagged a significant probability of a failed suppression scenario with catastrophic secondary effects. Section 2 addressed what she called the resistance-persistence problem. She had drawn on every historical case study she could find of civilizations that had continued to resist after conventional military analysis predicted capitulation, and she had built a statistical framework demonstrating that the human historical pattern of persistence dramatically exceeded the Dominion norm. She had included specific case studies, documented in the human's own records, of resistance movements that had sustained themselves for decades and in some cases generations, at enormous human cost, without achieving conventional military victory, and which had nonetheless eventually destabilized the occupying power sufficiently to force political resolution. The Dominion had not absorbed any civilization with this specific profile. She noted this directly. Section 3 was the one she had found most difficult to write, because it was the most honest and therefore the most likely to be dismissed. She had titled it, The Problem of Memory. In it, she had tried to articulate what she had understood, slowly and with great difficulty, about what made the humans different from the 61 worlds in Dominion history. The other species had been, most of them, reasonable in their way. They had assessed their situations and made calculations, and most of them had, eventually, made terms. The Dominion's record was clean, 61 out of 61. But the other 61 had not possessed this specific quality. The quality she had tried to name precisely in her notes and still felt she had only approximately captured. She had written, "The humans have developed, over the entirety of their recorded history, a cultural relationship to loss that transforms defeat into fuel. They do not simply endure suffering. They construct meaning from it, transmit that meaning across generations, and use it as the foundation for continued effort." This is not a military assessment. But it is a strategic one. A species that has spent 10,000 years learning how to survive loss, that has built entire cultural institutions around the practice of surviving loss, and that enshrines in its most widely shared stories the value of continuing to try when all rational analysis suggests stopping this species is not well modeled by standard resistance curves. The standard resistance curve assumes that a sufficient demonstration of force will produce a rational recalculation. This assumption is not historically supported for this specific civilization. She had included a section on the humans' treatment of their own historical atrocities, because she thought it was directly relevant. Most civilizations, when they committed acts that were later categorized as atrocities, either suppressed the record or incorporated the event into a narrative that justified it. The humans did both of these things in some cases, but they also did something that she had found nowhere else in 61 worlds of Dominion contact history. They built monuments to the victims. They required children to study what their ancestors had done. They created legal and political frameworks specifically designed to prevent repetition. They argued, continuously and painfully, about whether they had done enough, and the argument itself was evidence that they had not abandoned the question. A species that examined its own worst impulses with this degree of deliberate attention was a species that was, slowly and imperfectly, trying to become something better than it had been. She had ended the report with a recommendation. Not the recommendation she had been sent to produce, which was a cultural profile in support of tactical planning. A different recommendation entirely. She had recommended that the Dominion open a communications channel. She had noted, carefully and with full citation, that the Dominion had never attempted direct communication with a pre-contact civilization before conquest. The protocol had always been survey, assess, suppress, absorb. She had noted that this protocol had been developed in a context where the absorbed civilizations had not possessed this specific resistance profile, and that the assumption that it would generalize to all cases had not been tested. She had suggested that the humans, if approached as potential collaborators rather than as a resource to be managed, might offer something the Dominion had never considered acquiring, a model for cultural persistence that the Dominion itself lacked. She had noted that the Dominion's own history included several periods of significant cultural loss, where absorbed knowledge systems had been simplified and discarded because they did not fit the Dominion's administrative categories, and that the human's approach to preservation might address a problem the Dominion had not yet fully recognized it had. This last section was the one she was least sure would be read. It was asking the fleet intelligence apparatus to consider that the Dominion might have something to learn from a species it was currently preparing to conquer, and she knew how that would register with the officers who had spent their careers managing the Surveys suppress-absorb pipeline. But she had written it anyway because it was what she actually thought, and she had spent a month reading about a species that kept arguing for things even when the argument was unlikely to succeed, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the habit had been contagious. She sent the report and waited. Her father called her 3 hours after the report arrived on his desk. He looked older than she remembered, though it had only been 30 days. He was standing in his command room on the flagship, the star field behind him, and his expression was the one she associated with the moments when he was genuinely uncertain, which was rare and which she had learned to take seriously. 412 pages, he said. The situation required it. The fleet departs in 9 days. I know. He was quiet for a moment. He had read it. She could tell he had read it, at least the strategic sections, because he did not look dismissive. He looked the way he looked when a tactical model produced unexpected numbers. Carefully still. The nuclear probability estimate, he said. Conservative. I know. I ran the base model with your parameters. The conservative estimate is probably optimistic. She let that sit without comment. The resistance persistence analysis, he said. You cited 64 historical cases. There were more. I selected the most documented ones. The conclave will push back on the cultural sections. The memory argument, the art analysis. They will say it is not strategically relevant. It is directly strategically relevant, Sariva said. A species that has culturally institutionalized the practice of surviving loss is not well modeled by Standard Euro. I read the section, he said. I understand the argument. Another silence. The communications channel recommendation, he said. You are aware this has no precedent. Yes. The protocol has been the same for 4 centuries. The protocol was developed for a different class of problem. Her father looked at her for a long moment. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read precisely, which was a useful quality in an admiral and sometimes a frustrating one in a parent. He said, You spent 30 days reading about them. Yes. What are they? It was the question she had been trying to answer for 3 weeks. She had written 412 pages around it and she was still not sure she had answered it, but she tried. They are a species that decides, individually and collectively, over and over again, that the thing in front of them matters, she said. The specific person in front of them. The specific problem. The specific injustice. They are not efficient about it. They contradict themselves constantly. They believe things that are not true. They cause tremendous damage to their own world and to each other. But they keep deciding that things matter, and that deciding has produced something that I did not expect to find in a pre-contact civilization. A culture that is actively trying to become better than it has been, not just more powerful. Her father said nothing. They will not be easy to conquer, she said. The nuclear estimate alone should give the conclave pause. But that is not the reason I am recommending the communications channel. I am recommending it because I think we will lose something irreplaceable if we proceed, and I think we have already lost things we did not know were irreplaceable, and I think this species has something to teach us about what we have been discarding. A very long silence. The conclave will not approve a communications channel on the basis of a cultural assessment, her father said. I know. They will require a strategic justification grounded in risk modeling. I provided one. The nuclear probability estimate and the resistance persistence analysis together constitute grounds for an operational pause under standard protocols. An operational pause requires review. A review creates a window for alternative approaches. Her father looked at her with an expression that she had seen before years ago, when she had solved a navigation problem that had been frustrating his senior officers for 2 weeks. Not quite pride. Something more complicated than pride. You are asking me to use the strategic sections to force a procedural delay, he said. I am asking you to follow standard protocol when the risk modeling indicates elevated probability of mission failure. And while the review is underway, you intend to argue for the communications channel. I intend to argue for it regardless. But the review creates time for the argument to be heard. Her father was quiet for a long time. The stars moved slowly behind him as the flagship continued its orientation burn. I read the section on the photographs, he said unexpectedly. She waited. The practice of preserving the faces of ordinary people, he said. People who had not done anything of political or military significance. Just preserved because someone who loved them did not want them to disappear. Yes. I thought about your mother, he said, and did not finish that section immediately. Sariva said nothing. Her mother had been dead for 8 years. There was no official memorial. The Dominion did not build those. File an operational pause request on the basis of your nuclear probability modeling, her father said, and forward it to my chief of staff. I will review it within the hour. Yes, sir. Sariva. She looked at him. The woman in the photograph. In the report. The one with no name attached. She was not sure how to respond. She had included that detail in the memory section, almost as an afterthought, because it had affected her and she had not been able to articulate why until she had written it down. What about her? She asked. I looked for her, her father said. I ran the image through the survey archive trying to find a name. The data is corrupted. There is no record. He stopped. Someone thought she was worth preserving, he said. Someone decided she mattered enough to photograph. And now she is in our archive 60 light years from the world she lived on, and we do not know her name. He reached forward and ended the transmission. Sariva sat in the quiet of her workspace, in front of the terminal that held 30 days of human history, and thought about what her father had just said, and what it might mean that he had said it. Outside the viewport, the stars were very still. The fleet was 9 days from departure. The review window, if her operational pause request was approved, would be 14 days. She had made arguments with less time and weaker evidence. She opened a communications draft and began writing, in careful, measured language, the formal request for an operational review. She cited the nuclear probability modeling. She cited the resistance persistence index. She cited the Dominion's own protocols, which existed precisely for situations where standard models returned elevated failure probability. She did not cite the photograph. She did not cite the art. She did not cite the grief or the music or the 1,000-year arguments for justice or the tree on the island that everyone wanted to save. But she had spent 30 days reading about a species that had learned, over 10,000 years of practice, that the argument you made in the language your audience understood was not the same as abandoning the truth you were actually carrying. She finished the draft, read it once and sent it. Then she turned back to the archive because there was more she had not yet read, and she intended, whatever happened in the next 14 days, to keep reading. The woman in the photograph looked out from the screen. Sariva looked back. I know, she said to no one, or perhaps to someone who had been dead for 140 years and had never expected to be seen by anyone like this. I know. We are working on it. She turned back to her terminal. The stars outside were still and very far away, and the argument for now was still ongoing.